All right, so welcome today. Good afternoon, good morning. We're here to talk about business intelligence today, but we want to take come at it through the perspective of a non-technical view. We want to talk about what it is, why it's important, why we advocate it, and that way you can come away from this hopefully having a basic idea of why everybody is talking about business intelligence and why it's so important for organizations. So I am Reed Tyler. I'm the Associate Managing Vice President of Business Intelligence here at BWF. I'm joined by my colleague, Kaitlin. Kaitlin, if you want to introduce yourself.
Sure. I am the Director of Business Intelligence here at BWF, and I work on BI implementation and dashboard development in Power BI and Tableau.
All right, great. So I want to start today by talking about different platforms of reporting, right? So we have this concept of reporting or dashboards, and I kind of want to delineate between those and talk about why it's important to think about it like this. So here we see, can you spot the difference? Each of these look identical. They're both over 5 years. It's both 2019 to 2023. The figures are exactly the same. Maybe the font's a little bit different. Can anybody think about any differences between the three here? Go ahead and put it in the chat if you'd like. And we have a quiet group today, which is okay. So let's talk about this. So here's what I think about. So we're using Power BI as the example here, but this could be really any BI platform. So between Excel, PDFs, and Power BI for this example, first thing I think about is security. When we are doing reporting and sending out, call it PDFs or Excel files, we lack the ability to have robust security. That is something that Power BI and Tableau, for example, have a lot of granular capabilities so that you can apply security to different groups, different audiences, different perspectives, however you might do it, and it's always secure. I think about stale data. As soon as you export a report or export data and manipulate that in Excel, that's automatically stale. So if it takes you, call it 2 days to do a report, 3 days, you're looking at data that's from a couple days ago already. I think about accuracy. When we're defining things, business logic, call it, in Power BI or Tableau, we're typically doing that one time and then maybe adjusting that along the way, if we change our counting policies or whatnot. But typically we're doing that just one time and then we let it go and it just runs. Where if you are exporting data into Excel, you are likely manipulating certain things, maybe adjusting calculations or redoing the calculations each time. That can be a huge risk when it comes to accuracy of data. And what that means is that people don't trust the data. And that hurdle is very, very difficult to get over. We also want one source of truth. So we want the data to come from the source and not be manipulated, right? We don't want to do that manual manipulation because, again, that can be a risk for accuracy. I think about being able to be interactive, right? In Power BI and Tableau or others, you can drill down, you can have tooltips, you can answer questions, you can filter, you can highlight, you can do a lot of interactive actions that allow executives, for example, to answer secondary and tertiary questions as they're working through. Where, for example, a PDF, if there's a question about the data, maybe not even the accuracy, just what's behind this data or why did this spike happen, you might have to set up a phone call or send an email or set up a meeting, and that becomes a problem. We're automating everything we do. That's the goal, really, to save time with automation. So as I was saying before, when we're dealing with Excel documents, we are likely doing a lot of manual manipulation to get the data where we need it to be. Maybe we're cleaning it, maybe we're doing other things to it, and then putting it in a report format. That whole process can be automated. So that's our goal here. Going back to the executive example, thinking about the time to decision. If I have to set up, 2 phone calls and a meeting to understand a report or understand an insight, that time to decision lengthens. And so I can't be nimble in what I'm doing. Where if I have something that's interactive or something that I can drill into and answer my own questions, my time to decision has shortened drastically, right? And ultimately, we want to empower people with data. We want people to have access to data, be transparent about it, so that they can do their jobs more efficiently and more informed. So what is business intelligence as we think about it? So if you go back, there's a definition that simply says that business intelligence is the act of leveraging data for competitive advantage. So I think about it, we're not as competitive in nonprofits. So thinking about it for strategic advantage, how do we do things more efficiently using data? That's the whole concept in a nutshell. So if you think about it simply, it's the act of collecting data, storing that data, putting it in an organized manner to where it's accessible, and we have data governance rules, logic, all of that. Being able to analyze it, identifying patterns so that we can actually use the data, and then communicating it. I think about a lot of these BI tools as not just a reporting tool or a dashboard or something. It's not just to go get information. It's a communication tool. We're communicating that insight or communicating how we want to get to where our goal is, right? And then lastly, creating automations. I think that's a big thing that people miss that's part of business intelligence, is creating the automations of not just report and dashboard generation, but when something happens because of business logic or other, we can do things like send emails, create alerts, create task lists, do next best action, that sort of thing. So it becomes a prioritization tool as well. And this is the whole crux of it. When a lot of people think about business intelligence, it's really simply the data visualization dashboard development. That's what a lot of people think it is. But in our mind, it's a ton more. It's that entire spectrum, that entire pipeline of data that we're managing, making sure that we have the right policies to employ data governance, making sure the integrations are set up correctly, making sure we have the right tools to even visualize data in the first place. And then predictive modeling, decision science, change management, metric and KPI design. So it goes on, but it's this large spectrum of activities that ultimately get into what the end user is finding at the end, that being the data visualization, the automation, the dashboard. Kaitlin?
Yeah. So why do we advocate for BI? Why do we think it's so important for an organization's growth and success? And what is the goal for BI? At a high level, it saves a lot of time. You don't have to spend hours pulling data and creating reports because the reports will be automated. We want to be able to identify key data quickly and trust its accuracy. Business logic and calculations are consistently applied for each report, and that really feeds into that time to decision that Reed mentioned earlier. And we want to be able to communicate these insights in a simple but very effective manner. So a great question to ask is, how much time are you and your colleagues spending creating reports each month? If you're spending a day or two or more a month creating or maintaining reports, it's worth considering if that is the best use of time and whether automation is a good choice for your organization. Because ultimately, we want to have busy minds, not busy hands. We don't want our wonderful talent to be spending all of their time pulling data and creating reports. We want those brilliant minds we hired to be helping to inform our strategy and improve our processes and reach our goals, not sifting through the data. And this all feeds into a positive data culture change. When you leverage BI effectively, organizations can create a culture where data is embraced as a valuable asset. And decision making is rooted in evidence, and employees are empowered to contribute meaningfully to the organization's success. And from an executive perspective, it is crucial that all activities align with the organizational vision. Vision informs your strategy, and business intelligence plays a central role in this process. It communicates your tactical details, it assesses your progress towards goals, and it informs executives about the effectiveness of both your strategy and your vision so that they become a self-sustaining feedback loop. So to bring it full circle, why do we advocate for BI? In essence, BI functions at that intersection that we saw in the previous slide of vision, strategy, and your operational effectiveness, of providing those vital insights for informed decision making. So why do we visualize data? I have a quick question. Can you find the name of the person who has the third highest amount in this list before it disappears? Oh, it's going, it's gone. Sorry about that. So here we've visualized that same data, and it's a lot easier to find the name, right? And all we did was turn those numbers into bars of different lengths and stack them on top of each other. And what's great about this visualization is you don't even need to see the amount to find the answer that you need. And that's because we are using something called a pre-attentive attribute. These attributes are a visual property that is processed in our spatial memory without really any conscious effort. I think it takes about 500 milliseconds or less for your eye and your brain to process one of these attributes. And we use these to help our brain see patterns and prioritize information quickly. And we think very carefully about what kind of pre-attentive attributes we're going to use in our visualizations for maximum effect. Another thing we think about when we're thinking about data visualization is something that's referred to as the F pattern. And this is really the way in which our eyes tend to track across a screen or across a page of information. And we use this to inform where we place things on a dashboard. So our eyes tend to start at the top left-hand corner of a page and move across horizontally. And we drop down, and then our eyes move across horizontally again, and then our eyes tend to kind of drift down and scan information more quickly from there. So we really think about what we want to put at that top of a dashboard where our eyes land first, especially that upper left-hand corner. And we tend to put our sort of our big metrics, those big numbers that are the first thing that people are often wanting to see at the top of a page, because we know that's where their eyes are going to land first. And then we tend to kind of add more complexity to visualizations from there as our eyes scan down. Another thing we think about is something known as Jacob's law. And this states that it's the idea that users prefer to see things that they know from sort of previous familiarity. So they tend to prefer interactions and design patterns that they've seen before. So it's useful to think about those elements of websites, browsers or apps that you like that feel familiar and really aid in those things feeling like an intuitive experience for you, and incorporate those into a dashboard. So when you're thinking about placement, formatting, or icons, thinking about things that feel familiar to end users, incorporating that in can go a long way to making a dashboard feel like an intuitive experience for the end user.
Yeah, and the interesting thing to add to this, we were discussing this, how to visualize Jacob's law, and we have the play and the pause button. Because could you imagine if you created a new app that played music or a podcast or what have you, and you decided that you were going to do a new shape for play or a new shape for pause? That just seems like a really dumb idea. And so that's really to hit it home. And thinking about how people interact with computers nowadays, there are a lot of little things that we don't think about that just exist. Like, for example, by default, both in Windows and Mac computers, your app icons are at the bottom, right? Or in a browser, the tab that starts on the left side, and then as you add new tabs, they go right to left. And so thinking about this concept really critically in dashboard development is really important. How would people naturally find a filter? Would they have to go to a filter button? Would they prefer it on the page? Think about the other products or maybe even websites or apps that you're used to and apply those concepts to your dashboard. You'll find that the user adoption, when considering all of these user experience ideas, is just much, much better, and your dashboards are more intuitive.
Another thing to think about when you're thinking about dashboard design, or just, I mean, BI in general, is to start with the big idea first and work your way down to the details and the fine nuance. Find out what your why is for the dashboard. Why do you need to have a dashboard that has a certain kind of measurement, metric, information on it, and then sort of work into the details. That way you maintain a clear and cohesive vision for your dashboard that doesn't get kind of muddled or confused. So we've talked a lot about sort of the big picture of BI and data visualization best practices, but where do we really practically get started? If we're at the beginning of a BI implementation, where do we start? And where you really want to start is with your data source, with your CRM. And questions you should be asking are, what are your data governance policies? How accessible is the data in your database? What are the capabilities of your CRM? And then also, I think it's really important to consider what other data sources do you have other than your CRM. So a lot of organizations have different platforms for, say, tracking their event data or their ticketing data. And you're going to want to know and really think about what those are and make sure you're aware of all of the things that you want to bring together for this automation process. And consider the types of data that you might be keeping outside of your CRM too. Sometimes organizations are doing certain kinds of calculations on their data that live outside the CRM. They're tracking certain data outside their CRM. Think about ways that you can pull that into the CRM, bring that in, and start tracking that there, because the fewer data sources that you're bringing in to your implementation really is the better. And then also you want to think about what you're currently measuring and how you're measuring it. So are you creating ad hoc reports? Are you creating monthly reports? Are there routine tasks that rely on pulling data, but that maybe don't leave a paper trail? And how much time do these take? These are the things you want to think about so you can start to think about the kinds of dashboards you want to create and prioritize those. And then you want
to concept that we talk about real quick. Sorry, Kaitlin. Is the idea of thinking big about a project while starting small. And what I mean by that is when you're when you're embarking on a BI project, think big, big, big picture. Like, what are all of the data points that you'd love to report on, but maybe it's down the road. That way, as you're developing reports and measures and data pipelines and such, those considerations can come into play when it's necessary. And then by starting small, you're just making sure that you're moving the ball forward. So taking, what are the most critical reports? What are the most critical data elements that you need to define and report on? Starting with that, but keeping that big picture in mind.
Yeah, and you also want to think about how are you measuring the things in your reports? For example, are you counting gifts differently in one report than another, and why is it? What's the context behind those different kinds of calculations? Understanding those differences are really an important step to applying metrics consistently across your dashboards. And then the final thing I would mention here is also what Ree just touched on is what do you, thinking about kind of that report wish list or metric wish list, like what do you want to be able to measure but currently can't? And how can you start to incorporate that data into your CRM. Most organizations have something they wish they had data on and don't. So the ability to think long-term about your BI goals and how you can start tracking something now for future metrics, this is a great place to start for that. I mean, no organization has all of the data that they want. So it's a good place to start. Start with what you have, build out a few dashboards that really fully leverage the data that you have, and then you can continue to build from there as you continue to incorporate new data. Maybe it's just making sure that a certain data point is more consistently entered into your CRM. Maybe it's finding an attribute on a field where you can start tracking a new piece of information. But once you have 6 months, a year, 2 years of that data, you've got enough there to start building out a new dashboard. And so I know that we kind of threw a lot of different ideas and questions at you about what to consider about beginning this implementation process. So Reed and I developed a toolkit that has a series of checkpoints in it, that has all of these ideas and questions and a lot more in it, to help you wrap your head around these concepts and help build out that path towards BI implementation. So we have a QR code here that you can scan. It'll take you to the site where you can download this toolkit. And I will give you a moment to do that, and then I'll hand things back over to Reed.
All right. And we will also send out this QR code and link to everybody attending today as well. I think the most helpful thing about the toolkit is there is a lot. And when you're thinking big about these projects, there's a lot of things to tackle. And so I think one of the most helpful things that this toolkit does is it takes those checkpoints and takes all these concepts and puts them in bite-sized pieces so that you can consume them kind of linearly and have conversations about those checkpoints and such. So I think it is a really helpful toolkit. And of course, we'd love feedback. So the other problem is that there are way too many platforms out there for business intelligence. A lot of them are predefined for a certain software or for a certain database. Others work well with specific databases and such. But this is just a small population of everything that's out there. And so how do you choose what's right for your organization? I think that's one of the big question points that we get is, what do we do? So thinking about this crowded field, if we look back at Gartner's study, looking at the magic quadrant of why they think certain are leaders and visionaries and challengers and such, you can see over time that there's just a few kind of obvious leaders, and it kind of just finds its way to that natural organization, to where you're seeing some of these other organizations start to become challengers, I would say. But it's really Microsoft and Tableau that we talk about the most. We rarely see some of these other platforms. I have heard a lot about Google Data Studio and Google Schools using that platform. They like it. It's not quite as robust as Microsoft or Tableau, but it's an easy platform to get started with. In those visionaries, what you see is some of these, they talk about the visionaries being incorporating new technologies. So everybody's talking about generative AI and how AI can help put a lot of these platforms on steroids, right? Microsoft and Tableau have already started with that. Microsoft using Copilot, they're hopeful to release, my understanding, Copilot within the Power BI platform soon, so that you can have native speaking to code, so you don't have to be technical in nature to really get started and get into it. So how do you choose? And I think this is a difficult question. But when I think about it, I like to think about it from a business operations standpoint and think about what makes sense for the organization, not necessarily because of preference. But I think about first, what licensing do we have in our organization? You know, are we an Office 365 school or organization? If so, what level of licensing do we have? At a certain level, at a certain threshold for larger organizations, Microsoft Power BI just comes with your licensing. And so there's that just seems simple to me. Other organizations already have licensing for Tableau. We see a lot of educational institutions where their institutional research department has been utilizing Tableau for years. And so that makes sense. Once you answer the licensing question, whether you have it or not, then it gets into well, what resources and technical expertise do you have on your team, or what resources do you have access to? For example, we work with a couple clients that their IT team has internal Tableau training, right? And so it makes sense to go with Tableau if you have that resource available to you. And likewise, if your staff member has, you know, if you have Tableau licensing, but your staff member is an expert in Power BI, you know, maybe it makes sense to make that switch because you do have that resourcing. And then the cost, of course, Tableau and Microsoft Power BI are generally comparable, but Power BI has kind of undercut Tableau, I'd say. It's a little bit cheaper entry cost than Tableau. So if that's something that you're concerned about. Another thing to think about is the native connectors. So some of these tools, as you get down, are specific with which databases they can connect to or which APIs and such. And so if you're dealing with a custom API and it works really well, let's say with Sisense, or you have a native version of one of these softwares within your environment, then it makes sense to go with that, right? We think about Tessitur clients. They have Sisense just built right into the database. So other native connectors to consider are custom APIs. Custom APIs I find are easier to write if you need to through Microsoft Power BI. They can be done in Tableau as well. You see other platforms such as Razor's Edge, for example, they have leaned into the Microsoft space. You know, they have connections with Power Automate with their API. They have a custom built connector for Microsoft Power BI that you can get Blackbaud Razor's Edge data. So, and then finally at BWF, we do a lot of different things. We started our practice for business intelligence about 3 years ago. And while operationally speaking, we touched on reporting and best practices and such, we didn't really lean into it until about 3 or 4 years ago. And so our services are technical, but they're also strategic. Thinking about Power BI implementations or Tableau implementations, consulting on the whole data pipeline from data governance all the way to the data visualization, but also strategically thinking about KPI and metric design, helping organizations decide and choose where they want to grow or how they want to grow, how they want to motivate their staff, and what metrics make sense to do so. And then because it's BWF, we have all of these philanthropic council members that are subject matter experts in, call it annual giving or prospect development or gift officer training or executive council that we love to include in these projects so that it's not just a technical perspective. We bring the perspective of the experts in those specific fields. Also predictive modeling and AI-driven insights. We have partnered recently with IBM Watson to be able to provide an AI tool for people. So if you're looking for predictive capabilities at the speed of your business, which maybe is daily, you need predictive models to update and retrain themselves with machine learning. We can do that using IBM Watson partnership. And then, of course, we train everything that we do. We don't have any black box products. We like to conduct our projects with people, especially if there's somebody that's relatively new to one of these tools. We invite them along the journey. We tell them how we're doing it, why we're doing it, and get them in the weeds with us. So on that note, we are happy to take any questions, and you can put them in the Q&A or in the chat. I've got one. Kaitlin, how would you decide on which colors to use when you're designing your dashboards?
Sure. Well, with us, we usually start with the colors of the organization. Their thematic colors or branding colors is usually where we start because most organizations like to see their own colors and branding on their dashboards. So we will try to use as many of those colors as possible, but we also want to remain mindful of the psychology of color and what certain colors can represent to an individual. So typically, when we think of green, it might make us think of something very specific, or red kind of makes us feel something oftentimes specific. And if you see something like red, green, and yellow together, that also can really represent something to your end user, and you want to be mindful of, kind of what those visual representations are, and that you're not confusing or misrepresenting the data using the color. Another consideration I make is in regard to end users with a color vision deficiency, and always being mindful of never depending on color alone when it comes to sort of those visual signifiers. Always have a secondary visual signifier, like a data label, to make sure that everyone is able to understand the differences between data if they're not able to distinguish between two colors that you're using.
Great. We have another comment. At the very beginning, we mentioned stale data. Could you expand on what you meant with that in regards to using Power BI or Excel PDF? So simply put, I mean that with a system like Tableau or Power BI, the goal is to automate the refresh process. So as data is entering the system, that churns through whatever pipeline that you have that then is reflected in a dashboard. So it's always up to speed. So when you're opening your Power BI dashboard in a browser or wherever, it's always going to be up to date, versus when you export a PDF, it immediately becomes stale data, right? The next day, you're going to have out of date data. Another one, for sharing confidential information with volunteers or board members, what is the best practice for that is also user friendly enough? I would say there's a lot of softwares that do this really well. If you do want to use something like Power BI, you can set that up. They do have to be users for a normal licensing structure. The volunteers would have to have a user account within your organization. So I know a lot of board members, this is a question we get a lot. They do have a organizational email. You can assign them a license through Power BI, and then you can set up security parameters within a dashboard, or even as granular as row level security, so that the board members or people you're sharing this with are only seeing what you're giving them access to. Another one that came in, could you talk about your experiences? How did you get to this place of being a data guru? What do you think, Kaitlin?
Well, I don't know if I'd call myself a data guru necessarily, but I can certainly talk about my experiences getting here, which was maybe not necessarily a traditional path. I really started out in a completely different field. My background is in library and information studies. There's definitely parallels to the fields, but going into it, did not know that I was going to sort of do this deep dive into data visualization in fundraising. But I did end up getting a job in fundraising many years ago now, and basically was starting out building reports manually. My first job at that particular institution was creating a report that would take weeks, if not months, to complete every 6 months. And it was a obviously very time consuming manual process. And then our organization got Tableau, and I had the opportunity to learn Tableau and just kind of fell in love with data visualization, and just realizing the power of that automation that freed up so many hours of time. And I was able to really devote that time to thinking of and answering more and better questions than just kind of manually recreating the same report over and over again. It really expanded our ability to do much more complex analysis and much more sophisticated data visualization. So that's why I'm just a huge advocate for this process of implementation of BI, because I saw firsthand just the power of that and how it really gave me personally an opportunity to just do a lot more with the skills that I had.
Awesome. My experience is I grew up through finance and accounting. And so reporting and dashboarding has always been kind of in my blood, being data driven. And my similar to Kaitlin, what drives me every day is making sure that everything is efficient. From even granular details, if I have to do something more than once, I typically try to automate that process. Even if it takes me 40 hours to automate a 5-minute process, that's maybe one of my faults. But in doing so, having that mentality, I just think about how can we automate getting insights to people very, very quickly. We have this idea that we don't just have a dashboard to display information. We have a dashboard that gets to the why of that next step, asking people, okay, great. Once you have this information, what are you doing with that? Is it typical business logic to where you say, if this number is this, then you always do this? Well, if that's the case, let's get to that next step. Let's automate that and not just have information. Let's have actionable information, actionable steps and tools that we can prioritize our work. Another quick question, how do you feel about AI in business intelligence platforms when confidential information on giving, et cetera, is being held in that platform? Yeah, it's a big challenge. I would say, the big players, Microsoft Dynamics and Salesforce are dealing with this right now, is how, with generative AI, do we have a firewall or some kind of firewall is the easiest way to say it. Do we have some kind of a wall between, say, a company like OpenAI and these powerful tools so that we're not feeding sensitive information back? In keeping up with that, there are enterprise subscriptions that are, I believe, in the works with companies like OpenAI, to where you will be able to subscribe, and then anything that you put into the model, the large language model, is not fed then back to train, right? Instead, it stays within your environment and it's cut off, but you still get to use the engine of that large language model. I hope that makes sense a little bit, but yeah, it's definitely of top of mind, because you don't want to just take all of your data, all of your sensitive information, and give it to some predictive model that you don't trust the source with, right? The other thing to consider is, if you are utilizing a platform, let's say our partnership with IBM Watson, well, we know that IBM is HIPAA compliant, SOC 2 compliant. They follow all the regulatory rules and compliance. And so we don't have a concern with feeding it that data. And then finally, when we're applying predictive modeling, typically we don't need sensitive information, PII. What we need is anonymized data with the ID and such. So I hope that helps. Then we have another question that says, can you talk more about predictive modeling? How do you design and deploy it? Well, there's lots of different predictive models and lots of different options. When we were talking about, so we should separate the conversation of generative AI and predictive modeling. My colleague Alex did a wonderful presentation on this, but they're different things, and they've been in existence. The technologies behind there, the math behind these models, have been in existence for a long time. So speaking of predictive modeling only, we're thinking about what's going to happen in the future based on historical context, right? The easiest way to put that. So how do we design and deploy it is based on a business problem. I think the easiest way to do it is identifying prospects, right? How do we identify people that we think are most likely to give to our organization? And then how do you operationalize that? We can build that predictive model score into a dashboard that then becomes efficient for people to use. So you can say, here are the people in the top 10% or top 1% that we think are going to give. Here are their capacity levels. Combine those two information, and now our prospecting became very, very efficient. Let's see. What advice would you give with the necessity of sticking with metrics before jumping ship? Yeah, that's a really great, that's a good question. And I love talking about this topic because my background, finance and accounting, but also management. I have an MBA. And so I love managing people and motivating people to do the best that they can do and leverage their strengths. And so when you are applying metrics and you're seeing if that metric is going to do what you intend it to do, how long do you let it live? I think it's until you can quickly identify whether or not it's complementing somebody's strengths and or they're meeting goals. So when we have metrics, we have a benchmark to say, you know, we need you to raise $1 million by X time. Well, if that's the only metric, do they have the right tools? Do they have the right portfolio? Do we have everything else that will support them to do their job well? And if the question is yes, and the person is still not, conforming or meeting those goals, then we got to think about, is it the metric or is it the person? But I think it's tough because you have to give it time. You have to let metrics kind of prove their concept, be proven concept, or you have to let them kind of tell the story of we're motivating people in the wrong way, right? I think about the visit goal, for example. If somebody just has a visit goal, they're going to be motivated to not pick up the phone and call somebody or email or close deals through any other channel but visits, right? That's a big problem. So anyway, I think it's really critical to think hard about the metrics that you're employing. I think it's important that for metrics, no organization has the same metrics. I mean, you can be similar, but different organizations are at different maturity levels, and different people at your organization are at different maturity levels. Back to the gift officer example, if we have a brand new person, hopefully the metrics for that person aren't the same as the metrics for your most senior people, right? If you have an established, mature portfolio, there's a lot more opportunity there. If you have a brand new portfolio, we don't know. We have to do a lot of discovery and qualification. So the metric should motivate that behavior first, instead of just raising money with that mature portfolio. Okay, that's all the questions we have. We would love your feedback if this was helpful. If there are other things you'd like us to talk about in a future webinar, that would be great too. But happy holidays. Thanks for spending time with us in a busy season in December. And I think that's all from us. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.